interest of time, I won't let the demo play, but you're very welcome to go in and register your initiative. But really, if you're comfortable using any other tool and platform that you'll see today, please continue to do that, and we'll try and capture that a bit later. The second development is the firm geospatial platform. Right from the start, transparency and being able to access open data was seen as critical in support to the UN Decade. So we created this geospatial platform where you can see all the information related to restoration, and you can also access many of the tools and platforms that are available on the tools guide. So it's really great. And ultimately here, we want to be able to show country validated data on restoration. We're already having there the UN Decade flagships, and anything that's coming from the firm registry will be visualized here geospatially. Yeah, so again, another demo, but in the interest of time, I won't let that one play. You're very welcome to go in, have a look, provide feedback, and we'll keep improving the tools. So from FAO, I mean, in the last 3 years, we've really capitalized on digital innovation. There's so much excitement in platforms and tools, and it's really reflected in the tools guide. And from the Task Force on Monitoring and our work from the Framework of Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring, we've tried to filter all this incredible technology and innovation into accessible tools and platforms. We're still working on them, but please jump in, have a look, and let us know what you think. I just wanted to mention a few really interesting global developments. You may have seen at the end of last year, the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted by the CBD, and there's a specific target on restoration. This is really exciting. It basically is a target to restore 30% of degraded terrestrial, inland water, coastal and marine ecosystems by 2030. It's a headline indicator. And from the UN Decade and the Task Force on Monitoring, we're really proud to be supporting the methodological side, supporting Target 2. And again, the need to be able to monitor and report transparently is critical to this target, to the SDG agenda, and to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And this is some of our thinking about how we want to bring together different data sources and different platforms, support country validation of this data, and then report transparency on the global progress on restoration, both to the CBD Target 2 and to the UN Decade. So just very quickly, we're really proud to have supported this huge effort, and hats off to WRI and Climate Focus. We're really proud that 7 FAO tools are represented in the tools guide. We have 3 case studies, we have several examples, and really great guidance for selecting indicators through Aurora and what I just mentioned, the Framework for Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring. So congratulations again. Very quickly from FAO, some of the tools that are featured in the tools guide, we're really proud to be working with free and open source digital solutions. We call them digital public goods, and they've been really widely adopted, and we're really happy that they're in the tools guide for supporting our efforts to transparently monitor restoration. So that's all from me. Back to you, Gillian. Congratulations. I think the tools guide is an incredible contribution to allowing people to select the right tool and to be able to monitor and report their own restoration progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian, for that great contribution. And I want to recognize the huge contribution of the Monitoring Task Force in this space. And in fact, the tools guide grew out of work that started in the task force, an initial mapping and collection of tools that were available. And then we kind of built upon that. So it's been a partnership with the task force from the start to create this, and really appreciate the role that you guys play in driving collaboration. It's also great to be reminded, Julian, of the scope of the commitments that already exist, but now how the UN Decade has really helped us to link some of the commitments that have been in place for a number of years to some of the more tangible frameworks, like the Global Biodiversity Framework that was just signed. So really exciting time to be kind of refining and building the monitoring tools in this space. We'll come back to you, Julianne, at the end, probably with some questions from the audience, but for now, we will move forward. So I'm going to now turn to my colleague, Katie Raytar from WRI. Katie is a Senior Research Associate in the Global Restoration Initiative at WRI, and she's a GIS specialist focusing on using geospatial data to monitor restoration progress. Katie will introduce us to the tools guide.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much, Jillian. And I hope you all can see my screen. Yeah, I will be providing an overview of the Restoration Monitoring Tools Guide, highlighting some of the key features and content that will provide support on how to conduct effective monitoring and help users to identify the right monitoring tools. To provide a little bit of background on how the guide was developed, as Julian and Jillian were saying earlier, we found that there's been a significant level of investment in restoration activities, such as through initiatives like the UN Decade, Bond Challenge, JFR 100, Initiative 20 by 20. And along with that, there's also been significant interest in monitoring those activities to show progress. But to date, there's been a limited amount of guidance on how to conduct monitoring and what tools are available to support monitoring activities for restoration. And so to fill that gap, our team at WRI and Climate Focus collaborated with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring Task Force to shape the content. This included leveraging data collected from a large-scale survey to create a database of all tools available to monitor restoration, conducted by the task force. And from that, a comprehensive list of tools that was developed through that survey. We evaluated them and categorized them into groups based on their respective functions for monitoring. We also conducted peer review of the content, and we conducted user testing with nearly 40 experts in restoration and monitoring over the course of about a year. We also reached out to the network within the UN Decade Task Force to collect case studies on monitoring tool applications, which we compiled from 8 organizations. And I'll mention too that the focus of this guide is on terrestrial or land-based restoration monitoring, that sub-task force of the UN Decade. So there are 3 core objectives of the guide. The first is to introduce the essential steps for effective restoration monitoring, which I'll talk about in a few minutes in a bit more detail. The second is to provide a repository of available restoration monitoring tools and provide support on how those tools can be used for specific steps in restoration monitoring. And the third objective is to illustrate how the tools are used in real-world scenarios through case studies. And I'll move on now to provide a quick overview of the content available within the guide. There's an introduction section that provides background on the types of restoration that are included in the guide and why restoration and monitoring are important. Next section is all about how to monitor restoration, including essential steps for effective monitoring, a section on how to consider scale as part of your monitoring system, for instance, project or landscape scale monitoring, and also additional resources for users on monitoring. And another section provides some contextual information about the guide, how it was developed and how to use it, including the methods for how we selected the tools that were included in the guide and how to use the various features of the guide, like the tool finder. And so now focusing a bit more on the content of the guide, we've provided guidance on what are considered 5 key steps or components of any effective restoration monitoring system. I'll quickly mention these, and more details are available in the guide. but these steps are the basis for how we categorized monitoring tools. For example, which tools could support each of these steps. And the steps include defining the area of interest or the boundary of your monitoring activity, establishing a clear and consistent set of indicators to monitor and show progress, establishing a baseline against which to measure progress, collecting sustainable and reproducible input data for your indicators, and reporting results to your stakeholders and decision makers. And so building off of those steps, we have an application within the guide called the Tool Finder, which takes you through a few questions to help you narrow down which tools can support these steps. And the results are a short list of tools that fulfill that monitoring need. The chart on the side here provides an overview of the questions in the Tool Finder survey, which is a relatively short list of questions, as you can see. Now I will move on to a quick demonstration of how to use the Tool Finder, which you start by going to the Find a Tool button up on the top of your screen. And your first option is about choosing your methods, whether you want to use self-guided or or reach out to an organization for support on all steps of monitoring. But if you happen to choose self-guided, you then have more options here for what activities you want to conduct. For instance, collecting data for your indicators, which then brings you to 2 more options. For instance, if you're going to the field or you want to collect data remotely. And then you are at the end of completing that survey, you have an output list of tool results. For example, here's Collect Earth and Collect Earth Online. There's a summary of what the tool can be used for. And there's additional information about the scale of application, the languages it comes in, the cost, and the technical skills or resources required. And so each tool, each of these tool profiles is basically a short summary of what you can do with that tool. There are also links that will take you back to the host website so that you can get even more information or begin using it directly. And so as you can see, we have a variety of tools here: Trends.Earth, CIPAL, Restore, Global Forest Watch, Firm, Collect Earth. They're all tools available for doing remote data collection. You can also view all the tools. If you happen to not want to go through the survey steps, you can view all the tools in the guide. There's 25 total. You can filter them by language or scale, or jump directly to a particular tool. One example here, if you filter by landscape scale monitoring, you'll see all of the tools that can be applied for doing landscape scale. And so there's just a few different options for how to use the guide. And we're trying to kind of, make it easy for users to identify which tool will fit a particular need that they have. Oops. And next I'll move on to talk a little bit about the case studies that are featured in the guide. And so these are 10 examples from around the world, providing details on how several of the monitoring tools were applied. And these were contributed by the users or developers of the tool. And our next speakers, Lee and Sarah, are going to talk about a couple of those case studies that are featured in the guide. Lastly, I'll mention too that users of the guide have an opportunity to submit a tool. We recognize that this is a very dynamic and continuously evolving space, restoration monitoring. And we want to stay updated on tools as they're being developed or that may not have come up for some reason in our research or survey. And these tools will be reviewed for potential future updates of the guide. And lastly, I want to give recognition to all the contributing organizations and funders who made the guide possible. It was definitely a team effort, and we appreciate all the contributions that all of these different organizations made. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Jillian. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. So I know it was just a quick look for our audience. We definitely encourage folks to go ahead and explore the site themselves. You can find the link for the site in the chat. It's just been shared with everyone. And yeah, definitely encourage you to go in and explore and play around. I know there were a couple of questions in the Q&A about finding tools for specific uses or landscapes. Definitely recommend you go in and play around a little with the tool finder. Great, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Lee Winowicki. Lee is the Global Research Leader of Soil and Land Health at C4 ECRAF. She's the co-lead of the Landscape Restoration Transformation Partnership Platform and co-lead of the Coalition of Action for Soil Health, or CASH, CA4SH. And Lee's going to talk about one of the tools that's featured on the site.
Great. Thank you so much. This is absolutely fantastic. So I'm really excited to get our hands dirty, at least virtually, and talk about some of the advances in soil and land health monitoring to track ecosystem restoration. And I wanted to remind us and re-emphasize, just as Julian started off, that we must target investments in ecosystem restoration. And I loved his suggestion that we need to connect ecosystem restoration and what was promised at CBD, and I'll even say UNCCD and UNFCCC, because this includes the monitoring to prioritize actions, but also to track changes over time. And the bullet points here are just all the reasons why we do this, including food and nutrition security. So when I talk today and talk about the tools, I really have this in mind, that we need tools that are able to assess the natural diversity and the anthropogenic diversity that exists across landscapes. This requires a sampling design to capture this variability, technologies that are robust, that allow us cost-effective and accurate analysis, and that really boring word, data analytics. So the framework I'm going to talk about today is really stressing statistics, data analytics to assess these drivers, and again, tracking changes over time. And what I love so much about the tools guide that Katie just represented is that it talks about the span, the diversity of tools. So today I'll talk about how we're combining remote sensing with systematic field sampling and that really cool citizen science using apps and bringing it together in dashboards. Because I think what Katie was also emphasizing is there's not one tool to do everything, and that it's often this combination of tools that brings the power. So kicking us off, the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework. This is such a great photo of our team in northern Kenya. And you can see multiple people taking multiple measurements across a plot. So each plot is 1,000 square meters. And this is the LDSF tool that we've developed at ECRAF. And we have a brand new manual out, and you'll see it when you go into the tools guide. And in the center, I talk about the sampling framework. So it's a landscape scale, but we sample at the plot level. So it's many, many plots clustered across a landscape. That's one benefit. So this allows us to do that really systematic assessments. But on the right is where we look at the multiple indicators. So we look at soil carbon, we look at topography, soil erosion, land use, land cover, tree diversity, shrub diversity, all of these simultaneously. And what I personally love is this is the equipment that we use on the left. Very simple equipment that lead farmers, implementers can all get access to from the local markets. And I know because I bought these in many local markets. The most expensive thing is this GPS unit. So we have consistency across landscapes, low-tech equipment, this hierarchical sampling design, engagement with soil spectroscopy, and we assess multiple indicators. And the last point is that we apply this systematically across the global landscape. So a bias here in Africa, but across the global tropics consistently. So what you'll find is our case study in Rwanda, where we applied this in a massive restoration project, restoring 1 million hectares of land across 8 countries. We wrote a nice blog with the partners from various institutes in Rwanda. They did the LDSF in the field. On the left is one of the really cool outputs. So of course, I'm a soil scientist, so I'm going to show you a soil carbon map. You see some 2 squares. Those are the 2 LDSF sites that we conducted as part of the Regreening Africa project. These are in Eastern Rwanda. With these data, we were able to produce maps of 30-meter resolution for Rwanda. The bright yellow spots are low carbon. The darker spots are higher carbon. And then we use these maps to track how restoration efforts improved soil carbon over time, and I'll get there. We also can combine these carbon and erosion maps to create restoration priority areas. So looking at areas that would require a lot of effort, medium effort, or the green areas, no effort needed. While we did publish a scientific publication, we also published this type of information in a popular piece in the conversation, because of course, not everyone reads scientific journals. So where's the citizen science part? So citizen science is around public participation in scientific research. You can download the Regreening app on the Google Play Store, and also we'll put a link in the chat where you can read about it. This app has 4 modules. It will have more soon, but on tree planting, nurseries, and farmer-managed natural regeneration. This is exciting because farmers then go and track their restoration area. So that's the polygons there. Then we overlay this with the maps that we made from the LDSF, and we look at changes over time. I use this example, not from Rwanda, but from Niger, where we know it's dry, where we know it's low carbon, but yet we were able to see an increase in carbon over time in these marginal environments due to restoration activities that were led by the farmer. So we can track low carbon environments, we can track changes over time, and the farmers are also seeing this. In this case, it's due to increased tree planting and FMNR activities. So it's very exciting. And because even though I'm a soil scientist, I love trees. And I think in our restoration agenda, we cannot just talk about tree cover. We need to look at species. So back to that case study in Rwanda, we looked at which tree species were being planted. And I also show you from Ghana. So these are bar charts, essentially of frequency. And you can see mostly exotics, for example, grevillea in Rwanda and mango in Ghana. But looking at the important role that these species play in terms of farmer livelihoods. We also can look at FMNR data. This is Senegal, over 100 species. So a lot more species, a lot more diversity, and indigenous species in Senegal and Mali. And we've done this for all 8 countries in Regreening. You can check it out in the monitoring tools guide. So remember, it's not just about tree cover, but about species. And my last 3 slides, something so cool that I think we don't do enough is reach out to the public. Actually, the Regreening Africa app is in the Smithsonian Copper Hewitt Museum in New York City. If you're in New York, please go. Send me a selfie of you next to the Regreening Africa app exhibit. It's up for the full year, and talking about how restoration can contribute to peace. It's the Designing Peace app. And then, as I promised, the Regreening dashboard is where all this information comes. We can have the Rwanda tree diversity, soil carbon maps, soil erosion maps, looking at how many nurseries and where they are, all together into a platform. This is open for anyone. 8 countries from the Regreening Africa project are all here, because remember, it's all about translating science into action and really bringing these farmers into the process, not making monitoring something up high and top down, bringing farmers into the process, using the LDSF to generate evidence for stakeholder engagement. And finally, key messages. We have the tools to track. enabling us to monitor performance of restoration. The monitoring tool guide is a demonstration of that, and bringing scientific research and citizen science really can fill some key knowledge gaps. So I think I've done it under 10 minutes. Jillian, thank you so much. I'm so proud that C4ICRAF has been part of this and really looking forward to the engagement with all of you.
Thank you so much, Lee. Yes, all of our speakers have been right on their timing today, which is wonderful. Thanks, Lee. That's great. I'm so excited to go see. Did you say it's called the Designing Peace app in the Cooper Hewitt?
Yes.
Good. I
Yeah.
am here in the US, so I am very excited to go check that out this year. That sounds great. And Lee, you do such a great job of reminding us about the importance of stakeholder engagement, how we can actually use what sometimes sounds very dry to actually engage farmers, citizens in this whole process, very much in line with the spirit of the UN decade, I think. So that's wonderful. Great. Well, I will now turn over to Sarah Lutberger from Rainforest Alliance. Sarah is the manager for collective action at Rainforest Alliance, who primarily supports RE's landscape initiative in the region of Latin America. And previously, Sarah coordinated the piloting of Landscale in 5 landscapes as part of the tools development phase. Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jillian, and thanks to all the organizers for having me here today. It's really exciting to see all the action on restoration that's happening across these different initiatives and pulled together by this guide. So I'm really excited to share with you a brief overview first of the Landscale tool, and then specifically a case study from Southern Guatemala where Landscale was used to support restoration monitoring. I know Landscale goes beyond the focus of just restoration, but I will note that all of our founding pilots during the development phase had a restoration focus to them, and it continues to be a key element. So, we're really excited to be a part of this guide, both to, connect with potential users interested in restoration, but also to continue to be a part of this community and get feedback on how we can make sure the tool meets the needs of people today who are interested in restoration. So, just as to kick off an overview, Landscale has, I'm sure this is relevant to all of us. You can't manage what you can't measure. And so that's a main focus for us, looking at how to measure landscape level sustainability performance. We have tried to develop a practical but robust system that helps identify risks and opportunities in the landscape, convene stakeholders around common language and sort of a neutral framing for negotiation, and provide data and information that can help connect incentives and financing to landscape level action. It has 3 components in the tool. The first is an assessment framework and guidance that shows how to go through the whole process, and featured in the online platform that guides the assessment process. The second is a validation mechanism, both by the Landscale team itself, as well as a process for local review of the results before publishing. And then lastly, an online platform where can share the results and the final reports on the platform for a public audience. The tool has 5 steps to it. You'll notice a lot of overlap with these steps and the ones that Katie presented in the guide. Similar, sort of developing the assessment team, defining the boundary for assessment, selecting indicators, identifying data, screening, analyzing that to produce the baseline results, and then updated results in future versions, and then generating a report and publishing as interested. So this is a core component of that first section I mentioned, the assessment framework. These are the indicators. It's organized under 4 pillars, and then there are goals within each of the pillars. And then under that, what you can see here are the indicators, and not shown are another level of detail, the metrics, which is the level at which the assessment actually happens, the data evaluation, I mean. We tried to sort of, landscape sustainability covers a lot, but we tried to make it sort of broad enough to cover key issues, but also be flexible enough that it could be tailored to different landscapes, or sort of you can pull out the highest level issues to start with. So there's a process in the guidance to select which of these indicators are relevant in your landscape, as well as the metrics. It's really a focus on sort of continuous improvement. So as more data is found or generated, that can be included, or better quality data over time. So this is just a quick snapshot of everyone who's using Landscale all around the world, but today I really wanted to focus on this case study in southwestern Guatemala. A huge shout out to Mario Rodriguez, who's our colleague who's leading the work in Guatemala and helped me put this together. But the landscape in Guatemala was a pilot during the development phase of Landscale that was led by Rainforest Alliance and as well as Solidaridad, as well as a number of local partners. It's a landscape on the southern coast by the Pacific, by the border of Mexico. And its main commodities, it's a historically deforested landscape with sugar, palm oil, and bananas, sort of under industrial agricultural production within the landscape. And really the main challenge going into the work here was that there was a recognition that this deforestation, both historic and ongoing, caused a number of potential risks. So first was water scarcity and community access to water. In other watersheds in the region, there's actually been pretty massive social conflict when rivers hadn't flowed all the way to the ocean because there was too much use upstream. There's no, shockingly, there's no water law in Guatemala. And so this was a big concern for communities and companies within the landscape. And then there's also mangrove forests along the coast, one of the largest intact mangrove forests in the region. And not only is that important for biodiversity, but also community livelihoods from fishing and materials in the mangroves, as well as coastal resilience against storms. Storms are expected to get more frequent, more severe, and the mangroves protect inland areas against flooding and saltwater inundation. So really they were interested in using Landscale to, during the evaluation, identify areas of risk exposure, identify landscape actions collectively in line with the indicators of the framework, use the evaluation to monitor progress over time in repeat assessments, and use all this as the basis to drive further investment towards these landscape goals. So just as a snapshot, I won't spend time on this really because it's all in the platform that I think the link will be shared and everyone can go look at the detail. But just noting that they assessed the majority of the indicators. They actually wanted to assess more, but data availability was an issue. On the issue of restoration, I think the most relevant were the ecosystems pillar indicators, as well as the human well-being ones around standard of living, specifically access to basic services related to water, like water sanitation and hygiene. As part of completing the baseline, they used the results from different indicators to prioritize action and set the targets. So on the right side here, you can see the results from a number of different indicators within the baseline assessment: natural ecosystem conversion, degradation in key biodiversity areas, and then potential for restoration in forest areas in the landscape. And all of these, as well as some other data, were combined to create this map on the left side, which are the priority areas for restoration in the watershed, which goes beyond the scale of the landscape, but the landscape sort of fits in the lower half of that area. So this map was basically used as the basis to identify which areas had the highest priority and potential for restoration, and it primarily was in the mangroves, which you can see along the coast, but then also in the riparian zones along the rivers going into the upper watershed. So this was the basis for a collective target to be decided of 700 hectares of restoration by 2025. And then this was one of several goals that were put into the action plan, and used different land scale indicators to show sort of where they're at today and where they're trying to go. And I think a key component of this and a lot of the discussions that we had was, everyone's talking about restoration, but restoration for what? So a lot of the focus of the conversations and setting these goals was, what are we actually trying to achieve by restoring forest in the landscape? And then what are the other components that we need to do in order for it to be holistic restoration to achieve these goals that we're trying to, beyond planting trees, trying to address. And then just to close it out, another key focus was how to drive new investment into the landscape. So there's been some great progress on restoration so far. You can see in the mangrove areas has gone up the most dramatically. And then in the upper landscape area, that's mainly riparian zone restoration, has also expanded. This has been from new donor funding that we got from One Tree Planted, but also corporate financing. Agroamerica is a banana and palm oil company, and Magdalena is a sugar company. This has been sort of a main focus. They see a lot of potential for getting more of the companies in the area to directly invest in restoration. It's been interesting because they actually were investing some in restoration before this project, but it was pretty small scale and it was not at all coordinated towards any of these goals. So I think a lot of the feedback we got was interest in participating in the landscape approach, and using the Landscale tool was really being able to shift from saying, oh, we planted X number of trees, or we've restored a certain number of hectares, but using this framework can credibly talk about how the restoration that they're doing is actually a part of this collective plan, and over time can show how it adds up to the landscape scale outcomes. So, restoring areas in the riparian zones can improve, is that actually improving water availability in order to reduce social conflict? Or increasing cover of mangrove forests along the coast, is that actually having an impact on coastal resilience, and is it being done at a scale and the areas that's needed to address those risks? So both Agroamerica and Ingenio Magdalena participated in this process, but then also are going to be participating in a pilot where organizations financing or supporting actions towards these targets can use Landscale to make contribution claims about their impact on these landscape level goals. So thank you again so much. Feel free to find us in the tools guide for more information, the case studies there, and you can also log into our platform to see the full results from the Guatemala case, as well as the landscape action plan are on the platform. So congrats on the launch, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really great to be grounded in your experience and the use of the tool in a specific location, and see what that looks like in terms of the way you're thinking about progress and the interplay of different impacts on the ground. So thank you so much for that sort of on the ground look. And thank you to all of our speakers today. This has been fantastic to think about how monitoring is done from, big picture setting targets, and thinking about how monitoring links to the implementation of these UN conventions, all the way down to what it looks like for farmers, citizens, and practitioners to actually use these tools. We have about 10 minutes, actually close to 15 minutes for questions for our speakers. So I will open the floor or encourage you all, as you have been doing already, to put questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And some of those are being answered as the presentations are happening, but please feel free to continue to send those for our speakers. So we do have some questions already. I'm going to first ask Julian. Julian, what is the largest obstacle to having good monitoring data for the UN decade?
It's a great question, Gillian. I think today we've seen some incredible platforms, and I'd like to encourage everybody to make their data open and accessible to the global community. I mean, from my perspective, when data is not available, I think it makes our collective effort to track progress difficult. And from the UN decade, this is close to our heart, because we want to make sure that all the great work we've seen today is reflected in our collective effort to track progress. We have this critical 2030 agenda, and all the conventions and targets are lined up against that, and we really need to know whether we're on track or not. So just a big pitch for interoperability, open data, and data sharing. Thanks, Gillian. Back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Katie, can you talk about why we chose to focus on terrestrial restoration? There have been a couple of questions in the chat about other kinds of restoration, sort of ecosystem landscapes. So coral restoration, water. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the scope for the tools guide, and then any familiarity you have or even thoughts about if we might expand to other ecosystems.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jillian. Yeah, as Julian was saying earlier in his presentation, the UN Decade is focused on all ecosystem types, and of course, restoration of all ecosystem types is really important. At the same time, how you conduct monitoring for different ecosystem types, especially on land versus underwater, is really different. And we found actually when we were reviewing the tools that were collected as part of the survey, that there just wasn't a lot of overlap between, monitoring for these different ecosystems. And so having to choose one, we focused on terrestrial due to, some of our own expertise, and also, just there's also a significant number of tools available for terrestrial restoration monitoring, and in just tackling that one angle for now was actually a pretty big job. And so we decided, to be focused and to be, as accurate as we can on that ecosystem type for now. We decided to focus there, but do agree, monitoring of all ecosystem types is really important, and we definitely want to keep updated on how monitoring is conducted, for coral reefs, for other underwater ecosystem types, seagrasses and things, all really important. And there is potential, to expand in the future, as I mentioned earlier, that it is a really dynamic space right now. It's like we keep hearing of tools being updated, or even new tools coming online, almost in real time, it seems. So it is, we want to keep updated and make sure, that users have the best available information for doing their monitoring. And so there is potential, but, for now we're trying to keep it a bit focused and, on that one type, and kind of really get that accurate before moving on. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Lee, we have a couple of questions. This might be, maybe this is challenging, but I know you're up to this challenging question. And I'm asking you because you did such a nice job of talking about how community-led approaches can be integrated into monitoring. But someone asks, what approaches can we take to avoid or mitigate the burdens that monitoring might impose on those who are implementing restoration? And I wonder if you have thoughts on this, or if you've dealt with this in your projects, how to sort of manage the burden.
Yeah, I was reading that 4-part question in the Q&A myself, and I thought it was a fantastic point, because we definitely do not want to further burden anyone when we talk about monitoring. And that's why I think we found it's really rewarding, and has actually led to further scaling of restoration when communities are part of the monitoring. We absolutely did not go into it thinking that, but it turns out that when communities and farmers were invested in the monitoring, it actually led to further scaling. And we want to make sure the monitoring is light, so we're not burdening. So understanding clearly, what the key variables we want to monitor are, and then how to rapidly but robustly do this, I think, is the key. And I think that we've come a long way. And if you investigate all the tools that Katie and everyone have put together on the guide, these are really thoughtful tools that have made sure it's not super heavy, super expensive, or too intensive. but we're able to track changes over time, and that means we have to quantify. And I just think we need to keep that Q&A question on a sticky note with us all the time and make sure we're guided by that. There was also a question about gender, and I think that as we scale restoration, it's really important that we consider intra-household dynamics that really influence on-farm decision-making. We have several publications, I was going to put them in the chat, on how we've been addressing this. Because, for example, in Kenya, if we're going to restore 5.1 million hectares, it's going to be on farm. 70% of Kenya is rangelands, is drylands. The forests are protected. We really need to work with farmers, pastoralists to do this restoration. And it means we also have to look at social aspects. So I loved the two questions. Thanks, Jillian.
Thank you. And yeah, I totally agree. This is, there are a number of points that I think we need to, like you say, have a sort of virtual sticky note that we keep thinking about, that we come back to, both from the development of tools and also as we think about systems and how to create, guidance for those actually doing this work. That's not just more and more and more and more, but actually tries to find opportunities to draw on the assets that are already available to us to make this process easier, not more burdensome. Okay, lots of questions coming in. Thank you, everyone. This is great. Just to answer a couple questions that we've been getting a few of, we will share the slides and the recording after the presentation. And I think we can probably try to share all of those links as well. Someone asked if we can share the links that are in the chat. If you haven't seen, there are a lot of links to the tools that have been mentioned, some of the initiatives that have been mentioned, and of course, the tools guide are all in the chat. Sarah, a question for you. Based on your experience that you've talked about, do you have sort of thoughts on the role of monitoring and actually scaling up restoration from small scale projects to landscape or ecosystem level? Is this something that Landscale helps to deal with, or just that you have experience with?
Yeah, I think that's sort of a core focus of thinking about restoration at the landscape scale. I mean, just taking that example in Guatemala, I mean, like I said, there was some action to try to do restoration in that landscape before we started the landscape work, both by the local government, but also by some companies in the landscape. But there really wasn't any potential for scaling that we saw because it wasn't really being coordinated, but also from talking to people, it was like, yeah, we're doing this, but it's not really clear why. And in the long term, it's not clear how it's addressing these risks because it's not being coordinated. So we sort of got the sense that a lot might just sort of fade off and stop doing this kind of activity because they weren't going to see the actual impacts they were looking to achieve. So I think, yeah, that was sort of a guiding principle for sort of organizing different stakeholders around the landscape approach, in terms of thinking about aligning resources, the first step was, what's actually happening and how can that better complement each other? The second was what's happening that may not be the most effective way to be doing this, what resources are there but that are not flowing. There was a payment for ecosystem services program, for example, that was available, but farmers weren't using it to access the resources to plant trees on their land. So as part of this process, identify, what actually were the bottlenecks to sort of liberate that funding to actually have impact. And then the third was, what are new ideas of projects and new types of actions that could use additional financing, and then sort of making those more visible and sort of providing the data to show more confidently to somebody who would be looking to invest. If you invest in this, how can you have confidence that that's going to actually address the risk at scale? So I think for us, a big part of scalability is how do you make more obvious and more visible to everyone involved how actions at a project level are contributing to outcomes at a sort of landscape scale as we talk about it.
Wonderful. Well, there are a number of more questions. Apologies, we could not get to them all. Great discussion being sparked here today. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. As I said, we will be sharing the slides and the presentation, and we're really eager to continue this conversation through the various platforms that I've mentioned already today, the UN Decade Monitoring Task Force, the GROW Network, and through direct engagement with you all. Before we wrap, I just want to thank again our speakers, who did an excellent job today, stayed on time, allowed us lots of time to take questions, which is wonderful, and provided so much wonderful insight into how, well, first, the critical nature of monitoring of restoration to meet these global goals, and also to drive impact on the ground for landscapes and for communities. I also want to thank the contributors that Katie mentioned during her presentation. This really was a team effort. We had really wonderful input from CI, IUCN, Restore, Veritree, members of the UN Decade Task Force and the GROW, and our funders, the Good Energies Foundation and CLUA. So I want to thank all of those, and really, really appreciate you all joining us today, your engagement on this important topic, and we look forward to continuing these really important conversations. Thank you again.